For years, they saw him as just another truck driver, a ghost in grease-stained coveralls who smelled of diesel and cheap coffee, a man defined only by the rumble of his 18-wheeler. They saw the calloused hands, but they never saw the soul inside. They heard the gravel in his voice, but never the melody hidden within it. They laughed at his dreams and called them a fantasy. It was a joke whispered in the break room, a sneer across the parking lot. To them, his passion was a punchline, something to be dismissed with a wave of the hand and a cynical chuckle. But they had no idea his very last delivery wasn't an endpoint, it was an audition. A final desperate gamble on a lonely stretch of road that wouldn't lead to another warehouse, but to a destiny they could never have imagined. This is the story of how a humble truck driver became a legend, proving that the most extraordinary voices can come from the most ordinary of places. Frank Miller's world was made of asphalt and steel. It began before dawn, in the cold halogen glare of the Sterling Cross-Country Logistics Depot. The air hung thick with the smell of rain on hot pavement and the metallic tang of exhaust. Here, men moved with a tired, practiced rhythm, their conversations short and to the point, their faces etched with fatigue. Frank was one of them, but he was also a part. At 52, he was weathered by 3 decades of hauling freight from one end of the country to the other. He had a quiet way about him that his colleagues often mistook for being simple. They just saw a man who clocked in, did his job without complaint, and clocked out. A reliable, if unremarkable, cog in the great machine of commerce. They called him Freight Train Frank, not because they liked him, but because, like a train, he was predictable and steady. No surprises. Or so they thought. His co-workers, guys like Al, a burly foreman with a perpetually unimpressed face, Rick, a wiry dispatcher who lived for gossip, and Marty, a younger driver who thought arrogance was the same as confidence, operated on a simple, brutal code. Anything different from their reality of long hours, low pay, and constant deadlines was suspicious and deserved to be ridiculed. Frank's difference was his secret. A passion so deep and so out of place that he guarded it like a priceless treasure. In the cab of his Kenworth, among the logbooks, maps, and empty coffee cups, was a worn leather satchel. It didn't hold tools. It held sheet music, pages and pages of arias from the grand operas of Verdi, Puccini, and Donizetti. Frank Miller, the man they called Freight Train, was in love with opera. It was a love that had started decades earlier, from a chance radio broadcast during a lonely, snowbound night in the Rockies. A soaring tenor voice poured from the speakers, seeming to defy both gravity and sorrow, and it struck a chord deep inside him. He didn't understand the words, but his soul did. From that moment on, his truck cabin, the very symbol of his monotonous life, became his private concert hall. The roar of the engine was his orchestra, the endless ribbon of highway, his stage. He became a silent student. He devoured library books on music theory and listened to cassette tapes of the great tenors until they wore out. He spent what little extra money he had on second-hand CDs from La Scala and the Metropolitan Opera. He learned the Italian, French, and German lyrics phonetically, his rough, road-worn voice slowly learning to shape itself around the elegant, demanding notes. His colleagues knew nothing about this. They just saw Frank, sitting alone in his cab during lunch, a strange, far-off look in his eyes, his mouth moving silently. They heard him humming tunes they didn't recognize, melodies that weren't the country and rock that blared from the depot's radio. To them it wasn't a passion, it was just a sign of loneliness, an oddity to be mocked. Hear that? Old Frank singing to himself again? Al would say, loud enough for everyone to hear. Probably making up songs about way stations. Rick would chime in, his voice thin and reedy. I heard him the other day. Sounded like a cat getting its tail caught in a fan belt. The laughter that followed was a familiar sting. Frank would hear it, and a quiet wall would go up. He never reacted, never gave them the satisfaction. He'd just finish his coffee, climb back into the sanctuary of his cab, and let their laughter get drowned out by the phantom orchestra in his head. He had learned long ago that some people can only see the world as a reflection of their own smallness. Their ridicule wasn't about him, it was about them. But even the thickest skin can be broken. The day the laughter finally broke through started like any other Tuesday. A light drizzle slicked the asphalt, making the world seem gray and muted. Frank was doing his pre-trip inspection, his movements automatic, when a new driver, a kid barely in his 20s, walked up to him. "Hey, Frank," the kid said nervously. "Rick at dispatch said you were the guy to ask about music?" Frank paused, his hand on a tire. "Music?" "Yeah, he said you were an expert. Said you had a collection of opera?" The word sounded awkward and foreign coming from the young man's mouth. A knot of suspicion tightened in Frank's gut. Rick had never shown interest in anything beyond delivery schedules and gossip. "I have a few things I listen to," Frank said, his voice cautious. "Cool. My headphones broke, and I've got a long haul to Seattle. Rick said you had some amazing stuff, and he bet you'd loan me a CD. He said you had one called Nessun Dorma?" The trap was set. Frank's heart sank. Nessun Dorma was his anthem. It was the aria that had first captured him, the one he practiced with more devotion than any other. He had a rare, live recording of it, a disc he treated like a holy relic. He should have said no. Every instinct screamed at him to just walk away. But looking at the kid's seemingly innocent face, a small part of Frank, the part that still hoped for a flicker of understanding, gave in. "I have it in the cab," he mumbled. "Let me get it for you. But you have to be careful with it." He retrieved the CD from its case and handed it to the young driver, who thanked him and jogged back toward the main building. Frank watched him go, a deep sense of unease washing over him. An hour later, as drivers milled around the break room for their last coffee, it happened. The depot's PA system, usually reserved for route changes and safety warnings, crackled to life. But instead of Rick's voice, the opening chords of Puccini's masterpiece filled the air, tinny and distorted. And then, the voice, a powerful, soaring tenor. For a single, breathtaking moment, there was silence. The drivers looked around, confused. Then, Al's booming laugh echoed through the room. "Well, I'll be," he bellowed. Freight Train Frank's got himself a theme song. The room erupted. It was a wave of loud, unrestrained, cruel laughter. Frank stood frozen as the majestic aria was twisted into a tool of his humiliation. Over by the dispatch window, Rick was standing with a smug grin on his face, the young driver beside him looking ashamed. They had taken his sacred thing and made it a joke. Someone started mimicking the singer in a high, cartoonish falsetto. Another pretended to conduct with a plastic spoon. The sound of their laughter was louder than his engine, more piercing than any horn. It was the sound of his dream dying. Frank didn't say a word. He placed his untouched coffee on the counter, turned his back on the noise, and walked out. He walked through the rain as the jeers followed him, climbing into his cab and closing the door. The silence inside was deafening. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The hurt was immense, a hollow ache in his chest. But underneath it, a new feeling was taking root. It was cold, hard, and unyielding. It was resolve. They had laughed. They had had their fun. But he would not let their small, empty laughter be the final note of his song. The humiliation at the depot became a fire. It burned away any hope Frank had for acceptance, and replaced it with a quiet, unshakable determination. His passion was no longer a hobby. It was a mission. His truck was no longer a sanctuary. It became his training ground. The long hours on the road transformed. The endless stretches of I-40 and the winding climbs through the Appalachians became his rehearsal space. He started from scratch, spending hours on breathing exercises, his diaphragm tightening with each controlled exhale. He practiced scales against the drone of the tires, pushing to smooth out the rough edges and find the power he knew was there. He used his layover time not for sleep, but for study. He bought a small, used tablet and used spotty truck stop Wi-Fi to find online forums on vocal technique. He watched masterclasses on YouTube, mimicking the posture of a celebrated baritone teaching from a studio thousands of miles away. Then, he took the biggest leap. He found a vocal coach in Chicago, a stern but brilliant woman named Dr. Anya Petrova. He couldn't afford in-person lessons, but she agreed to work with him remotely. Once a week, from a quiet corner of a deserted parking lot, Frank would prop his tablet on the dashboard and sing. "No, Franklin, no," she'd command through the tiny speaker. "You are singing from your throat. It is a garage door. I want the sound to come from the basement, from the earth. Again." He took every critique. He'd drive for 10 hours, deliver his payload, and then spend another 2 trying to lift the sound from his basement. Every spare dollar went to these lessons. His diet became sandwiches and black coffee, but his spirit was being fed a feast. He also found new inspiration. During his drives, he listened to stories about famous people with humble beginnings. He learned that Elvis Presley was a truck driver for Crown Electric Company when he was trying to get discovered. An audition manager once even told Elvis to give up singing and stick with being a truck driver. A bitter smile touched Frank's lips. He knew that feeling. He discovered that the great filmmaker James Cameron drove trucks to save money for his first film, dreaming up entire worlds while on the road. He read that actor Liam Neeson once drove a forklift and trucks for the Guinness Brewery. These stories were more than just trivia. They were proof. They were evidence that the cab of a truck didn't have to be the final destination. It could be a launch pad. If a truck driver could become the king of rock, roll. If another could create worlds like Top Guitar, then maybe his own dream wasn't so foolish after all. 6 months passed. The change in Frank was subtle on the outside, but inside, a revolution had occurred. His voice, once raw and unpolished, now had resonance, control, and a depth of emotion that came from a place of deep, personal struggle. Then came the email from corporate, forwarded by Rick without comment. It was about a unique, high-priority delivery for a client named Mr. Alistair Sterling. The name sent a jolt through Frank. Alistair Sterling was a legend in the music industry, a reclusive genius producer who had discovered some of the most iconic voices of the 20th century before disappearing from public life. The delivery was for a shipment of rare, vintage audio equipment, moving from a studio in Nashville to Sterling's private estate in Northern California. The memo stressed that due to the, quote, irreplaceable and sensitive nature of the cargo, only the company's most senior, most reliable driver would get the job. It was his final delivery. After 30 years, Frank was planning his retirement. This run was scheduled for the week he was meant to turn in his keys. It was a poetic end. He went to the dispatch office. "I want the Sterling delivery," Frank said. His voice was quiet, but it had a new firmness that made Rick look up. Rick scoffed. "You, Frank? It's a high-stress job. Fragile cargo, tight schedule." "I have 30 years on the road and not a single insurance claim," Frank stated, his gaze level. "My record is perfect. I'm the most qualified." Rick grumbled, but something in Frank's eyes stopped him. "Fine. It's your funeral." As Frank walked away, he heard Al's voice from across the room. "Sending freight train to the fancy music, man? Hope he doesn't try to sing for him." The usual snickers followed, but this time, they didn't touch him. They were just noise from a world he was already leaving behind. This wasn't just a delivery, it was a pilgrimage. His 2 worlds, diesel and opera, were on a collision course. The journey to Alistair Sterling's estate felt different from the thousands of trips Frank had taken before. He drove with an almost religious focus, the precious cargo, a physical stand-in for his own fragile hopes. He barely slept. He didn't listen to his recordings. Instead, he sat in silence, letting the music play in his head, resting his voice for a performance he wasn't even sure would happen. After 3 days, he turned onto a private road that climbed deep into the coastal mountains. He arrived at a pair of imposing iron gates, which swung open to reveal a long driveway leading to a stunning modern house of glass and redwood, overlooking the Pacific. He parked the truck, and the rumble of his engine died into an almost disrespectful silence. A woman in a sharp business suit approached him. "Mr. Miller? I'm Miss Evans, Mr. Sterling's estate manager," she said, her eyes giving him a quick, dismissive scan. "Our team will handle the unloading. You can wait here." "I'd prefer to oversee the unloading myself," Frank said, his voice steady. "It's company policy for high-value cargo. I'm responsible for it until it's signed for." Ms. Evans looked annoyed but nodded. "Very well, but do not touch anything." The unloading was agonizingly slow. Technicians in white gloves moved like surgeons. Frank stood to the side, a silent, invisible giant in his work clothes. The courtyard had a peculiar, perfect, acoustic quality. Every small sound seemed to hang in the air. To calm his nerves, Frank began to hum. It was subconscious at first, a habit from 1,000 lonely nights. He hummed a tragic, beautiful aria from Tosca. He thought he was being quiet, that the low, resonant sound was just for him. He was wrong. On a second-floor balcony, Hidden in the shadows, Alistair Sterling was watching. A man in his late 70s, he had come out to check on the delivery, but he stopped when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was a pure, powerful melody, full of aching sadness, and it was coming from the truck driver. It was rough, sure, but underneath was a tone, a color, a raw, untamed emotion he hadn't heard in 20 years. Intrigued, he came downstairs. Frank didn't notice the old man approaching until he was just a few feet away. His humming stopped. Panic flared, certain he was about to be reprimanded. Sterling's eyes were piercing. "What was that?" he asked. His voice was quiet but carried an undeniable authority. "Sir, I apologize," Frank stammered. "I was just humming." "You didn't answer my question," Sterling said, stepping closer. "The melody, what was it?" "It's from Tosca," Frank whispered. "Puccini, e lucevan le stelle." Sterling's gaze intensified. He studied Frank's calloused hands, his tired face. None of it made sense. "You know Puccini." It was a statement, not a question. "Yes, sir, a little." There was a long, heavy silence. The technicians stopped working, watching. Ms. Evans looked mortified. Sterling ignored them all. His focus was entirely on Frank. "Sing it," Sterling commanded. Frank stared, bewildered. "Sir!" "Sing it again," Sterling repeated, his voice firm. "Not a hum. Sing, for me, now." This was it. The moment from his wildest fantasies was happening, right here. The fear was a cold wave threatening to drown him. He could refuse, get in his truck, and drive away into a quiet retirement haunted by this single moment. Or he could take this one, impossible chance. He took a deep breath, the way Dr. Petrova had taught him. He closed his eyes. He didn't see the producer or the gawking technicians. He saw the empty plains of Wyoming at sunrise. He felt the rumble of his engine. He channeled every mile, every lonely night, every sneer, and every ounce of love he had for this music into his lungs. And then he sang. The voice that came out of Frank Miller was not the voice of a tired truck driver. It was the voice of a man who had lived a life of quiet desperation and found his only solace in beauty. It was filled with the raw power of a force of nature, now shaped by months of disciplined practice. It soared through the courtyard, a torrent of pure emotion, the notes climbing higher and higher, filled with a pain and beauty that silenced the birds and made the very air vibrate. He held the final heartbreaking note until it faded into nothing. He opened his eyes. The technicians were frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. Ms. Evans' mouth was slightly agape. Alistair Sterling stood perfectly still, his eyes closed. When he opened them, they were no longer piercing. They were seeing Frank, truly seeing him, for the first time. "My God," Sterling whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Where in God's name did you come from?" A week later, the break room at Sterling Cross Country Logistics was quiet. A local news report was playing on a tablet propped up on the counter, and a dozen drivers were huddled around it. Legendary producer Alistair Sterling, in retirement for 15 years, announced today he is returning to the studio, the reporter said. And the reason for his return is perhaps the most shocking part of this story. He has discovered a new, once-in-a-generation talent. Al, Rick, and Marty leaned in. The screen cut to a press photo. Alistair Sterling on his balcony, his arm resting on the shoulder of another man. The man was Frank Miller. He wore a simple dark sweater. Not his uniform, but it was unmistakably him. He looked uncomfortable, yet there was a new light in his eyes, a quiet dignity they'd never seen. Sterling's new protege is not a conservatory prodigy, the reporter continued. He is, in a story that sounds like a Hollywood movie, a 52-year-old long-haul truck driver from this very city. A stunned silence fell over the break room. The mockery that had once filled this room was gone, replaced by disbelief. Rick stared at the screen, his face pale. Marty just shook his head slowly. Al, the loudest of them all, was speechless. He remembered the jokes, the sneers, the day they had humiliated Frank over the PA system. A wave of shame so potent, it was almost a physical sickness washed over him. The man they had laughed at, the man they had dismissed, was being hailed as a prodigy. They hadn't just been wrong, they had been blind. The company owner was already on the phone with a local paper, his voice booming with false pride. "Oh, absolutely. I always knew Frank had something special, a real class act. We're all so proud of him here at Sterling Logistics. Yes, Sterling Logistics. Isn't that a funny coincidence? Frank never drove a truck again. He moved into a small cottage on Sterling's estate. And his days were no longer measured by miles and deadlines, but by scales and arias. Under Sterling's demanding mentorship, the raw power in his voice was refined and polished. His life was no longer about hauling freight. It was about carrying a melody. He didn't become a superstar overnight. He became something more, an artist. His debut album, recorded with the very vintage equipment he had delivered, was a critical sensation, praised for its staggering vocal power and emotional honesty. Back at the depot, Frank became a myth. He was the ghost who had once walked among them, a reminder of the worlds that might be hidden behind any ordinary face. The laughter in the break room was quieter now, the jokes less cruel. They had learned, in the most dramatic way possible, that you never really know the measure of a man. They had laughed at the truck driver, and their laughter had turned to ash in their mouths. Because true passion is a force of nature. It can't be contained by a job title, a uniform, or the small-minded ridicule of others. It grows in the dark, it thrives in silence, and when it's finally ready, it emerges into the light, not for applause, but because it simply can't be held back any longer. The world is full of people like Frank, who carry secret symphonies inside them. Their stage might be a kitchen, a cubicle, or the cab of a truck. Their dreams might be silent, but they are not absent. If this story inspired you, or if you believe in the power of a hidden dream, let us know in the comments. We want to hear from the underdogs and the dreamers. And for more stories that prove the doubters wrong and celebrate the incredible power of the human spirit, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because you never know where the next legendary voice will come from.